Some men discover their wife's infidelity and experience a complete breakdown. They plead, they lose their composure, and they seek comfort in substances at 2 in the morning, wondering how such a betrayal was possible. I'm not that man. Welcome back to The Hidden Air. My name is Julian Vance, and the night my wife attempted to leverage my life as a stepping stone for another man, I simply poured a glass of wine, offered a polite smile, and whispered 2 words in perfect French that rendered a very powerful man entirely speechless. But before we reach that moment, we must begin at the foundation. If you do not understand my origins, you will not grasp why the sequence of events that followed was meticulously calculated, not accidental. It began on a Tuesday, a day that feels profoundly inappropriate for the unraveling of a life. I had endured a particularly arduous day of client consultations. When I returned home, my wife, Eloise, was leaning against the kitchen counter with that specific expression she wore when she had an agenda. "Julian," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, "Sebastian would like to host us for dinner this Friday." He expressed a desire to meet the man behind the woman. Sebastian Croft, my wife's superior and the managing director of Croft Sterling Capital. He was the archetype of Sydney's corporate elite, the kind of man whose bespoke suits carry more prestige than the average person's annual earnings. I had heard his name mentioned for 2 years. I had heard it during Eloise's late-night calls and noticed the way she avoided my gaze whenever his name surfaced. I looked up from my laptop, maintained my composure, and offered a simple, "That sounds pleasant. I look forward to it." Eloise blinked, visibly surprised by my lack of resistance. She was likely prepared for a display of jealousy or territorial insecurity. Instead, I simply smiled and returned to my work. What Eloise could not possibly know was that I had been preparing for this encounter for nearly 2 years. The days leading up to the dinner at Circular Quay were a masterclass in controlled observation. To an outside observer, our life in our Vaucluse residence appeared perfectly synchronized. Eloise maintained her morning routine with a precision that bordered on the clinical, while I continued my professional obligations as a financial analyst, monitoring market fluctuations and institutional reports with my usual diligence. Yet, beneath the surface of our domestic stability, the reality was fractured. Eloise, perhaps sensing that I was not the man she had underestimated, began to navigate our home with a heightened sense of caution. She was preparing for a performance, carefully selecting her attire for Friday evening, as if it were a tactical uniform. She spoke of Sebastian Croft with a reverence that was entirely misplaced, or perhaps entirely deliberate. She described him not merely as an employer, but as a visionary who saw potential in her that I had supposedly overlooked. I listened to these monologues without interruption, my responses limited to polite, non-committal acknowledgments. I was a spectator to my own marriage, watching as she laid the groundwork for a betrayal she believed I was too oblivious to detect. During those evenings, I spent considerable time in my study, finalizing the structural analysis of the Croft Sterling Fund. My work was not motivated by malice, but by a cold, forensic necessity. I had traced the threads of Alistair Croft's estate for months, and the evidence was unequivocal. Sebastian was not merely my employer's director. He was the primary beneficiary of a legacy that had been built, in part, on the erasure of my mother's dignity. I knew that Friday would be the inflection point. Eloise had requested that I dress in a way that would not draw undue attention, a subtle nudge to ensure I remained the supporting character in her and Sebastian's narrative. I agreed with a pleasant nod, knowing that my attire was the least of her concerns. She wanted a partner who would play his part, the silent, agreeable husband who would validate her proximity to power. On Thursday, I received an encrypted document confirming the final amendments to Alistair Croft's medical directives and his estate's oversight committee. The pieces were now fixed in place. I watched Eloise from the doorway as she practiced, her mannerisms in the mirror, her reflection revealing a woman who was entirely convinced of her own cleverness. She was playing for a future she believed was secured by her association with Sebastian. She had no inkling that the man behind the woman she was introducing was, in fact, the one person with the legal and financial authority to dismantle her entire worldview. The harbor was unusually still that week, the water reflecting the city lights with a deceptive, mirror-like clarity. It was a calm that felt heavy, pregnant with the weight of the inevitable. I felt no agitation, no desire for a confrontation that would result in a messy public spectacle. My goal was not to scream or to beg. It was to ensure that by the time the dessert course concluded, the illusion of Sebastian Croft's absolute authority would be permanently shattered. I spent the final hours before the dinner ensuring that every document, every digital file, and every witness account was positioned for immediate activation. Friday arrived not with the thunder of a storm, but with the quiet, professional certainty of an audit being finalized. The foundation of the dinner was set, and for the first time, I looked forward to the arrival of the evening. The memory of my mother, Carol Vance, rarely surfaced in the high-pressure environment of a Sydney trading floor. She was a woman of singular purpose, an architect of quiet endurance who had raised me in the modest surroundings of a rural township in Victoria. Our life was defined by the rhythm of her double shifts: nursing at night, service at the local cafe by day, and the evening rituals of vocabulary quizzes that felt less like chores and more like survival training. She never spoke of my father. She never offered explanations for his absence, nor did she harbor any visible bitterness. She simply existed as a pillar of unwavering resolve. Until the winter, she was admitted to the hospital in Melbourne. I was 31 when I sat beside her bed, watching the monitors record the steady, indifferent rhythm of her life fading. Her hands, once firm and steady, had become fragile, translucent maps of a life spent in service to my future. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness, but as the evening light waned, she turned to me with a clarity that defied her physical decline. "Julian," she whispered, her voice carrying the same authoritative stillness that had governed my childhood. "There are revelations that can no longer be deferred." "Mother, you should save your strength," I replied, my voice failing to mask the tremor of anxiety I felt. "Hush," she murmured, a faint, nostalgic smile touching her lips. "I have spent 3 decades maintaining a silence that has served its purpose, but you deserve to know the lineage of your own strength." She took a labored breath, her gaze fixing on mine with an intensity that held the weight of decades. "Your father is Alistair Croft. He was a visiting lecturer at the university when we met. I was young, and he was undeniably persuasive, but the reality of his world was incompatible with the one I chose to provide for you." The silence in the room became absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic pulse of the medical equipment. She described the ultimatum he had presented: a one-way ticket and a sum of money intended to ensure his anonymity. She had accepted the distance, not because of fear, but because she recognized the inherent corruption in a life built solely upon inherited prestige. "He has an heir, Julian, a son named Sebastian. He currently directs the family interest. Alistair is elderly, his health is failing, and I have heard through the few contacts I maintain that he has recently begun the process of amending his estate documents." She reached out, her hand resting briefly on my own. "I'm telling you this not to incite conflict, nor to encourage you to seek a reconciliation with a man who abandoned his obligation. I tell you this so that if you ever find yourself standing in the shadow of his creation, you will recognize exactly what you are holding. You possess a capacity for resilience that was not inherited from the Crofts. It was forged through the necessity of our own journey." She passed away 4 days later. The grief was profound, but it was eclipsed by a sudden, chilling clarity. I did not spend my time in mourning. I spent the subsequent months utilizing the same forensic methodologies I applied to my corporate work. I traced the threads of the Croft-Sterling empire, analyzing the legal filings, the tax structures, and the estate planning documents. I discovered that Alistair had indeed begun the process of reconciling his past, seeking to acknowledge a lineage he had long sought to erase. I was no longer an anonymous analyst. I was an inconvenient reality residing within the periphery of Sebastian Croft's perfect world. My mother had provided me with the final piece of the puzzle, and as I watched the data patterns assemble themselves, I knew that the dinner on Friday was not merely a social obligation. It was the moment the hidden history of the Croft family would finally collide with the present. Following my mother's passing, my professional life underwent a subtle but fundamental transformation. I am, by trade, a forensic financial analyst. My role is to navigate the complex layers of corporate architecture to identify the movement of assets, the concealment of liabilities, and the underlying logic of a firm's success or failure. I have always viewed a company as a living organism, defined not by its public statements, but by the integrity of its ledger. For 6 months, I applied this expertise to the Croft Sterling empire with a level of intensity that transcended mere curiosity. I was not looking for standard market anomalies. I was mapping the anatomy of a dynasty. The threads I followed were intricate. Alistair Croft, for all his public reputation as a titan of the Sydney financial landscape, had left a digital and legal trail that suggested a man attempting to reconcile with a lifetime of ethical omissions. I identified 3 offshore holding entities that were being systematically restructured, a process that mirrored the preparation for a major estate transfer. Sebastian, acting as the managing director, was clearly maneuvering to consolidate his operational control, yet the documents indicated that he was facing mounting pressure from institutional auditors regarding the valuation of these specific assets. The coincidence of my wife's professional trajectory began to sharpen into focus. It was no longer a question of serendipity that LOEs had been recruited into Sebastian's inner circle at the precise moment he was seeking to insulate his operations from regulatory scrutiny. I began to monitor the communication flows between their offices. I did not need to access private records. The metadata of professional correspondence provided sufficient insight. Sebastian was not merely employing LOEs. He was utilizing her proximity to me, a senior analyst at a firm that held significant cross-referencing capabilities, as a potential intelligence asset. I found the realization to be profoundly clinical. There was no room for the emotional turbulence one might expect. Instead, I felt a sense of objective detachment. I was observing a predator attempting to incorporate a perceived threat into his own defensive perimeter. I realized that my presence in his orbit was not an oversight on his part. It was a calculated risk. He likely assumed that a man in my position, preoccupied with domestic and professional demands, would remain oblivious to the strategic chess match unfolding around him. By the time LOEs returned home that fateful Tuesday, I had completed my assessment. I knew the extent of the Croft Sterling exposure, the nature of the regulatory pressure Sebastian was attempting to navigate, and, most importantly, the exact vulnerability he harbored regarding his father's estate. I was no longer the unassuming partner he believed I was. I had become the primary point of failure in his meticulously constructed defense. I remained composed, continuing to perform the role of the devoted husband and the reliable analyst, while in the digital silence of my study, I finalized the dossier that would render Sebastian's current position untenable. The dinner at Circular Quay was no longer a prospect I approached with anticipation. It was an engagement I had already secured the outcome for. The architecture of his undoing was complete, and I was merely waiting for the opportune moment to initiate the collapse. In the days preceding the dinner, I refined the final parameters of my strategy. To execute a change of this magnitude, one does not require brute force. One requires the precise application of leverage. I spent my mornings analyzing the Croft Sterling portfolio for the final time, ensuring that the inconsistencies I had uncovered, specifically concerning the valuation of the offshore holding entities, were not merely clerical errors, but systemic failures that would attract the immediate attention of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. I maintained my professional veneer with unwavering discipline. At the firm, I continued to provide the high-level analysis that my superiors expected, while simultaneously isolating the specific files that would document Sebastian's mismanagement. My interaction with LOEs remained consistent with the expectations of our marriage. I played the role of the observant, supportive partner who was entirely detached from the machinations taking place within the corporate sphere. She continued to believe that her influence over me was absolute, frequently sharing superficial anecdotes about Sebastian's management style, details that she deemed trivial but which, to me, served as confirmation of his growing desperation. On Wednesday, I finalized the physical preparation. I secured a confidential briefing document, a summary of the irregularities I had identified, and ensured it was digitally accessible through a secure, off-site server. I did not intend to present this information to Sebastian directly. That would have been an amateurish display of aggression. Instead, I intended to signal to him that I possessed the complete inventory of his professional vulnerabilities. The objective was to force him into a position where he would be compelled to acknowledge my existence, and by extension, the truth of his father's estate. By Thursday evening, the psychological landscape of our household had become starkly defined. Eloise was noticeably distracted, her focus entirely on the optics of the following evening. She was preparing for a role that would solidify her standing within Sebastian's inner circle, unaware that the stage she had built was anchored to a foundation of my making. I watched her from the periphery, noting the precision of her preparations. There was a cold, pragmatic quality to her ambition that I had once mistaken for passion. Now, I recognized it as a transactional necessity. I felt a profound sense of clarity regarding my own position. I was not driven by a desire to reclaim the Croft name or to assume a role within a legacy that had abandoned me at birth. I was driven by the necessity of asserting institutional and personal integrity. Sebastian had operated under the assumption that the world was comprised of those who could be bought and those who could be ignored. By the conclusion of Friday's dinner, he would be forced to reconcile with the reality that there existed a third category, those who had spent years observing his architecture with the intent to disassemble it. I concluded my preparations with a sense of professional satisfaction, knowing that the trap was no longer merely set, it was fully operational. I was ready to initiate the conversation that would permanently alter the trajectory of the Croft dynasty. Friday evening arrived with the crisp, cooling breeze characteristic of a Sydney autumn. The restaurant, situated at the edge of Circular Quay, offered an unobstructed view of the harbor, a panoramic display of the city's commercial power. It was an environment designed to intimidate, characterized by hushed conversations, the rhythmic clinking of fine crystal, and the presence of individuals who measure their success by their proximity to the center of authority. Sebastian Croft was already seated when we arrived. He occupied the central position of the table, his posture radiating the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the primary focus of any room. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that bespoke an effortless, inherited wealth. As we approached, he rose with a fluid, calculated grace, offering Eloise a gesture of deference that was precisely calibrated to be noticed. When he turned his attention to me, his smile was broad, yet failed to reach his eyes, a classic hallmark of someone who has already performed a risk assessment and determined the threat level to be negligible. "Julian," he said, his tone possessing the polished, slightly clipped cadence of a private school upbringing. "I have heard so much about you. Eloise speaks of your analytical precision as if it were a rare, exotic talent. I believe she is merely being generous with her observations, Sebastian," I replied, my voice steady, reflecting a professional courtesy that was entirely devoid of warmth. "I appreciate the hospitality. It is a welcome change from the typical demands of the firm." We seated ourselves. The service was impeccable, unfolding with a rehearsed efficiency that left no room for awkward interruptions. The conversation initially remained within the safe confines of industry trends and the broader economic climate in Sydney. Sebastian steered the dialogue with the expertise of a seasoned navigator, ensuring that every topic reinforced his own relevance. Eloise played her part with polished, enthusiastic agreement, her laughter punctuated by frequent, performative glances in my direction. I observed them both with the detachment of an auditor. Sebastian's arrogance was, as I had surmised, his primary vulnerability. He was so accustomed to his status as the architect of his own reality that he remained entirely oblivious to the fact that I was actively deconstructing his framework in real time. I engaged with polite, probing questions regarding the fund's recent performance metrics, deliberately highlighting the specific areas where I knew his figures to be inconsistent. I watched as his expression flickered, the first subtle indication that he realized I was not the conventional husband he had anticipated. He attempted to regain control of the narrative, his tone shifting toward a more directive, patronizing register. Yet, I remained unfazed, meeting his gaze with a composure that clearly unsettled him. The ambience of the room, once so conducive to his performance, began to feel increasingly restrictive. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time in a decade, that his influence was not universal. As the transition from the entree to the dessert course approached, the air at the table grew heavy. The stage was set for the final act, and Sebastian, despite his considerable resources, was entirely unprepared for the reality that the evening would no longer adhere to his design. The transition to the final course was marked by a silence that felt deliberately orchestrated. The harbor lights outside shimmered against the glass, casting a cold, artificial glow over the table. Eloise, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure, reached across to touch Sebastian's arm, a gesture of intimacy that in the context of the evening appeared increasingly performative. She offered a brief, triumphant glance at me, entirely unaware that the narrative she had constructed was on the verge of total collapse. Sebastian, momentarily emboldened by her validation, leaned back, his wine glass held with the casual arrogance of a man who believes his status is an impenetrable barrier. "Julian," he began, his voice dropping into a register of patronizing condescension, "Eloise and I were discussing the future of the firm. You possess a methodical mind, though I suspect you lack the ambition required to truly excel in our industry. You are far too comfortable in the background." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, savoring the vintage before placing the glass down with absolute precision. The table went still. I leaned forward, the distance between us narrowing until the only sound was the faint, ambient hum of the restaurant. I did not raise my voice. I did not employ the theatrics of an aggrieved husband. Instead, I shifted into the language of the elite, the language of the old world, the language that Alistair Croft had utilized in the study where he had once reconciled his own history. "Ambition is not the concern, Sebastian," I said, my voice cutting through the space in perfect, precise French. "C'est une question de légitimité. Notre père, Alistair, attendait depuis longtemps que cette question soit posée. It is a question of legitimacy. Our father, Alistair, has waited a long time for this question to be raised." The effect was instantaneous. The blood drained from Sebastian's face with a clinical, surgical speed, leaving him pale and unnervingly rigid. His hand, which had been poised to pick up his glass, froze mid-air. Eloise pulled her hand away as if she had been burned her, eyes darting between us, the confidence that had defined her demeanor all evening dissolving into genuine, unadulterated panic. Sebastian stared at me, his mouth slightly parted, his practiced composure shattered. He understood exactly what I had said, and he understood the weight of the name I had invoked. The silence that filled the space was not merely uncomfortable, it was absolute. For the first time, he was not the managing director of a premier firm. He was simply a man confronting a reality he had spent his entire adult life attempting to obscure. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing down on our table with an intensity that seemed to cause the very air to vibrate. For approximately 11 seconds, the environment around us, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of distant patrons, the rhythmic harbor traffic, faded into a background of inconsequence. Sebastian Croft, the man who had navigated the most treacherous waters of Sydney's financial sector with singular ruthlessness, was currently staring at me with the vacant, uncomprehending expression of a man who had suddenly found his fundamental reality rendered obsolete. His mouth remained slightly agape, a visceral reaction that he was, for the first time, unable to suppress. In that moment, he was not the managing director of Croft Sterling Capital. He was an exposed asset. He was attempting to perform a rapid, high-level recalculation, searching for a framework in which this revelation could be mitigated or contained. It was a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. Eloise, by contrast, had moved past confusion and into the realm of profound, existential dread. She remained frozen, her posture hunched as if attempting to shrink away from the scrutiny of the room. She had built her entire future on the assumption that I was a predictable variable, a static background feature of her life. Now, the realization that she had been the most uninformed person in the room and that her professional leverage had evaporated in a single sentence was manifesting as a visible, shaking tremors in her hands. I maintained my composure, observing them both with the professional detachment of a forensic auditor. I picked up my wine glass, tilted it toward the candlelight, and took a measured sip. "The vintage is quite refined, Sebastian," I remarked, my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the merits of a standard market analysis. "I find that even the most complex portfolios benefit from a period of decanting. It clarifies the sediment, do you not agree?" Sebastian eventually managed to close his mouth, his jaw tightening into a rigid, defensive line. He was a sharp man. I had never doubted his intellectual capacity. Even under the duress of this revelation, his mind was racing to reorganize his defense. He reached for his glass, his movements precise yet deliberate, as if he were practicing a physical exercise to regain his equilibrium. When he looked back at me, the warmth had been entirely excised from his eyes. He had shifted into survival mode. "You speak French," he stated, his voice devoid of its earlier, performative charm. It was a flat, clinical observation, the sound of a man attempting to reclaim the narrative through the assertion of a simple, undeniable fact. "I have possessed a fluency in the language for many years," I replied calmly. "My mother believed it to be a professional asset." It seems she was correct in that assessment. Eloise found her voice, though it was strained, thin, and entirely devoid of its usual authority. "Julian, there's obviously a misunderstanding here. This is simply not." She faltered, unable to complete the sentence. She looked to Sebastian for a lifeline, but he did not acknowledge her existence. He was entirely consumed by the implication of my presence. I turned back to him, ignoring her entirely. "I have no intention of causing a public scene, Sebastian. That would be beneath the dignity of the family interest we share. However, do not mistake my decorum for a lack of resolution. The circumstances of the estate are no longer a matter of your private discretion. We are beyond the necessity of theatrics. Shall we continue this conversation, or would you prefer to settle the bill?" The finality in my tone left no room for negotiation. He was trapped not by me, but by the irrefutable truth of his own history. The power dynamic of the past 2 years had been permanently inverted. The silent husband had become the architect of the firm's inevitable structural audit. I sat back, my posture relaxed, and allowed the realization to propagate. I did not need to elaborate. I did not need to present the dossier or explain the offshore accounts. The invocation of Alistair's name and the recognition of our shared lineage had provided all the context required. Sebastian attempted to speak, but the refined, confident cadence of his voice was gone, replaced by a strained, shallow breath. I smiled, not with malice, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally seen the ledger balanced. I picked up my menu, gesturing toward the waiter. "Now that the formalities of the evening have been addressed, shall we discuss the dessert menu? I believe they serve an exceptional chocolate ganache." The journey back from Circular Quay to our residence in Vaucluse was defined by a silence that was far more forensic than it was social. Eloise sat in the passenger seat of our vehicle, her physical presence reduced to a rigid, trembling frame. She did not attempt to initiate conversation. The realization that her professional and personal ambitions were now entirely subordinate to my discretion had effectively silenced her. I remained focused on the road, the rhythmic sweep of the harbor lights across the windshield providing a consistent, cold illumination of the landscape. I was already contemplating the next phase of the process. Upon entering our home, Eloise retreated immediately to the living area, her composure finally surrendering to the stress of the encounter. She collapsed onto the sofa, the veneer of the sophisticated careerist completely stripped away. I did not follow her. Instead, I walked directly to my study, the space where I had spent hundreds of hours dissecting the Croft Sterling architecture. I needed to move beyond the emotional aftermath of the dinner and re-engage with the objective reality of the situation. A few minutes later, Eloise stood in the doorway. The defiance that had once characterized our interactions was absent, replaced by a hollow, desperate vulnerability. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. It was the question of a woman who had realized she had been living with a stranger. "I'm the man you married, Eloise," I replied, not looking up from the monitor where the estate oversight documentation remained open. "The only difference is that you were never interested in the truth of my origins, only in the utility of my presence." The revelation at dinner was not a departure from who I am. It was a long overdue transparency. "The baby," she said, the words catching her throat. "What happens to us?" I paused, finally turning to face her. The emotional residue of our marriage, the genuine affection, the shared histories, the trivialities of a life built together, remained, yet it was now obscured by the weight of her deceit. I had prepared myself for the possibility that she would not know the paternity, but hearing it confirmed in that hollow, shameful tone was a profound test of my resolve. "I do not require an immediate answer regarding the future of our domestic arrangements," I said, my tone clinical. "My primary concern is the integrity of the truth. Regarding the child, that is a matter that will be adjudicated through the appropriate legal and biological channels. Until then, you will remain here, and you will not attempt to communicate with Sebastian." She did not argue. The realization that she had been an instrument in Sebastian's strategy and that she had been discarded by him the moment the risk became tangible had left her without a defensive position. She understood that I was not a man who operated on impulse. I was an analyst who functioned on the accumulation of facts. I returned my attention to the screen. I had not achieved triumph. I had achieved a state of total institutional control. Sebastian was currently experiencing the volatility of a man whose foundations have been compromised. He was likely reviewing his legal liabilities, calculating the cost of a public disclosure, and realizing that his father's estate was no longer his to command. I had reached the moment where the personal and the professional intersected. I did not feel the need to destroy him. I simply required him to acknowledge the reality of the estate and the validity of my lineage. The compromise was already being drafted in the language of facts, and for the first time in years, the narrative was entirely under my supervision. The clinical environment of the private wing at the Royal Melbourne Hospital felt entirely removed from the opulent, performative world of Sydney's financial elite. I arrived on a Tuesday, a day I had come to associate with the inevitable unraveling of illusions. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the muted hum of life support machinery created a stark, grounding atmosphere. I had notified the nursing staff of my arrival, and after a brief professional verification, I was escorted to the suite where Alistair Croft, the patriarch of a multi-billion-dollar dynasty, was witnessing the final chapter of his influence. He was significantly diminished, a fragile silhouette against the expansive backdrop of the room. The formidable reputation he had cultivated over decades of financial dominance was now condensed into a physical state of profound vulnerability. Yet, as I approached the bedside, his gaze shifted toward me with a piercing, residual clarity. It was the same analytical intelligence I had observed in the reports I spent years studying. He studied my face for a protracted moment before he spoke, his voice raspy but surprisingly resolute. "You possess your mother's uncompromising integrity," he said, the words seemingly effortless despite his physical distress. I recognized the jawline, but it was the silence, the way you held the truth, that confirmed your identity. "You are Julian." "I am," I replied, maintaining a professional distance that felt appropriate for the gravity of the encounter. I pulled a chair to the bedside, sitting with a composed stillness. "I have not come to discuss the redistribution of your holdings, nor am I here to seek a retrospective validation of my existence. I am here to understand the decisions that define the architecture of our separation." Alistair turned his head, looking toward the window, where the Melbourne skyline was silhouetted against the Ensrothing Twilight. He recounted the chronology of 1991, a period of career-defining ambition where his fear of institutional instability outweighed his personal commitments. It was not a confession of remorse. It was a cold, objective assessment of a structural failure in his own judgment. He spoke of the investigator he had commissioned 18 months ago, his discovery of my mother's passing, and the subsequent, frantic attempts to amend the estate documents before his health deteriorated beyond the capacity for legal action. "Sebastian is a talented individual," he stated, his tone shifting toward a clinical assessment of his legitimate heir. "He is disciplined and strategically adept, but he lacks the moral equilibrium required to oversee the foundation of this interest without guidance. He has been under scrutiny for regulatory noncompliance for several months. His attorneys have been attempting to manage the fallout, but the structural integrity of the fund is now compromised." He reached toward a sealed envelope resting on the bedside tray, pushing it toward me with a steady, deliberate motion. "This contains the formal documentation of my intentions, witnessed and notarized by my personal counsel. It is not an invitation to participate in a legacy that is already fractured. It is an acknowledgement of a responsibility I failed to uphold. You may utilize this documentation at your own discretion. It is the only inheritance that possesses any remaining validity." I took the envelope, the weight of the document representing the formal conclusion of a narrative I had been analyzing for the entirety of my adult life. There was no theatrical display of emotion, no sudden reconciliation. There was only the quiet recognition of a truth that had been systematically obscured. I remained with him for another hour, discussing the logistics of the Oversight Committee before I rose to depart. As I walked out into the corridor, I felt a strange, profound sense of release. I had not sought a father. I had sought the missing component in the ledger of my own history. With the documentation in my possession, the final variable of the Croft Sterling interest was secured, and the resolution of the matter was now entirely within my control. The resolution of the Croft Sterling interest did not culminate in a public scandal, as Sebastian had undoubtedly feared. Instead, it unfolded through the precise, methodical application of regulatory oversight. On Monday morning, I arrived at the firm's headquarters not as an intruder, but as a party with verified standing. I was accompanied by legal counsel specializing in corporate governance, a team whose reputation for discretion and institutional stability was beyond reproach. We convened in the executive boardroom, the same space where Sebastian had spent years projecting an image of untouchable authority. When he entered, the transformation in his demeanor was stark. The performative arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out expression of a man who had finally performed an accurate audit of his own insolvency. He had spent the preceding days in intense consultation with his legal team, realizing that the combination of the SEC-level regulatory scrutiny and the authenticated estate documentation left him with no viable defense. "The documentation regarding the offshore holding entities is already with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission," I stated, my voice echoing in the stillness of the room. "The voluntary disclosure you have prepared is the only mechanism that will prevent a comprehensive criminal investigation. It is not a negotiation, Sebastian. It is a clinical necessity." Sebastian sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. He did not attempt to argue. He had reached the logical conclusion of his own choices. "I have authorized Whitfield and Associates to begin the full disclosure process," he said, his voice flat. "The resignation of my operational interest will be filed effective immediately." The process was handled with an efficiency that was almost entirely devoid of sentimentality. We did not discuss the betrayal, nor did we dwell on the animosity of the past 2 years. Those were personal externalities that held no weight within the boardroom. What remained was the structural integrity of the firm, a firm that was now under the management of an oversight committee mandated by Alastair's estate. Sebastian's departure was absolute. By Wednesday, the nameplates in the executive suite had been updated, and the narratives surrounding the leadership transition were strictly managed by the communications department to ensure market stability. The institution survived, as institutions often do when the primary point of failure is excised. I did not assume the role of managing director, nor did I seek a position of prominence within the organization. My objective had never been to inherit the position of the patriarch. It was to rectify the ledger of my own history. I ensured that the Oversight Committee was staffed with professionals committed to regulatory transparency, effectively safeguarding the interests that my father had intended to secure. As I walked out of the Governor Philip Tower for the final time, the city of Sydney seemed remarkably indifferent to the change. The harbor ferries continued their rhythmic transit, and the financial district proceeded with its relentless, cyclical pursuit of growth. I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of administrative closure. The secret that had defined the silence of my childhood and the complexity of my adulthood had been integrated into the public record. I had not dismantled a legacy. I had simply corrected an omission, ensuring that the history of the Croft Sterling interest was finally grounded in the truth. The audit was complete, the books were balanced, and for the first time, I was entirely free to define the trajectory of my own life, unburdened by the requirements of a dynasty I never chose to lead. The aftermath of my departure from the Croft Sterling interest was marked by a period of quiet, intentional reconstruction. I relocated to a property on the periphery of Sydney, where the atmosphere was governed by the rhythm of the tides rather than the volatility of the financial markets. The conclusion of the oversight transition allowed me the space to finally address the domestic complexities that had remained suspended in the wake of the Circular Quay dinner. My separation from Eloise was finalized through a process, characterized by a mutual recognition of the structural impossibility of our union. We met one final time in the neutral environment of a mediator's office. There was no vitriol, no theatrical recounting of past grievances. The reality of our situation, the fundamental shift in our perception of one another, had rendered further discourse unnecessary. She relocated shortly thereafter, seeking to reestablish her professional trajectory in a different market, unencumbered by the complications of her association with me. The matter of my son, Daniel, remained the focus of my existence. He was a boy of remarkable composure, possessing an innate curiosity that I found deeply grounding. I chose to speak with him with the same transparency that my mother had eventually extended to me. I understood that the narrative of his origins was complex, and I ensured that he was introduced to the history of his family not as a burden, but as a documented fact. He would never experience the silence that I had navigated. His life would be anchored in the truth of his heritage and the resilience that define us. I maintained a periodic correspondence with the executors of Alastair's estate, ensuring the long-term sustainability of the trusts intended for the preservation of the Croft interest. My involvement was limited to the fiduciary oversight I had committed to providing. I had no desire to return to the boardroom, nor did I seek the prestige associated with the Croft name. The capital that Gerald, and eventually Alastair, had directed toward me was managed with the same forensic precision I applied to every professional engagement. It served as a resource for Daniel's future, a testament to the fact that while the legacy was inherited, its utility was entirely our own to define. I still reflect, on occasion, on that Tuesday in our Vaucluse kitchen. I recall the precise moment Eloise leaned against the counter, the cadence of her voice, and the absolute certainty I felt as I looked up from my laptop. It was not a moment of manipulation. It was the acknowledgement of a sequence that had already concluded. Some individuals define their lives by the kingdoms they construct and the influence they wield. Others define their existence by their capacity to withstand the pressures of those kingdoms without compromising their integrity. My name is Julian Vance. I am the son of a woman who worked multiple shifts to ensure my foundation was secure, and I'm a man who integrated a fractured dynasty into the reality of the public record. I have navigated the complexities of parentage, the dissolution of a partnership, and the demands of an institution that believed its authority was absolute. I have reconciled the ledger of my history, not by seeking what was promised, but by securing what was owed. As I look toward the harbor from my study, I feel no residue of the previous years. The accounts are reconciled. The narrative is my own. And for the first time in my life, the path forward is defined entirely by the choices I have made, rather than the expectations I was required to fulfill.